So the primary purpose of urine production is to maintain homeostasis by regulating the volume and composition of the blood. And this process involves the excretion of dissolved solutes, especially urea, which we create from amino acid breakdown, creatinine, which comes from the breakdown of high-energy compounds creatine in phosphate, which happens in the skeletal muscles, and we also have to excrete dissolved uric acid, which we get from the breakdown of RNA. So the kidneys produce urine that is 4 to 5 times more concentrated than normal body fluids in 3 ways: by filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So filtration is the movement of water and solutes across a filtration membrane, and this occurs exclusively in the renal corpuscle. Reabsorption is the process of returning water and desirable solutes back to the body, which occurs primarily in the proximal convoluted tubule. And secretion is the transport of undesirable materials missed by filtration. This occurs primarily at the distal convoluted tubule. Water, sodium, and potassium are regulated by interactions between the nephron loop and the collecting duct. So blood pressure at the glomerulus tends to force water and solutes out of the bloodstream and into the capsular space. For filtration to occur, this outward force must exceed the osmotic pressure of the blood. The net force promoting filtration is called filtration pressure. The filtration pressure at the glomerulus is higher than the capillary blood pressure because the diameter of the efferent arteriole is slightly smaller than the diameter of the afferent arteriole. So blood hits this bottleneck and the pressure increases in the glomerular capillaries. The amount of filtrate produced by the kidneys per minute is the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. The average is about 125 milliliters per minute, or about 180 liters per day, but 99% is reabsorbed in the renal tubules. Glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, is dependent on maintaining adequate blood flow to the kidneys and maintaining adequate net filtration pressures. So events at the proximal convoluted tubule include 60 to 70% of filtrate volume being reabsorbed. All glucose, all amino acids, and other organic nutrients are reabsorbed here. You also have ionic reabsorption of sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and carbonic acid. And remember, some of these are hormonally regulated, like calcium, which is regulated by the parathyroid hormone, and some secretion occurs here, like the secretion of hydrogen ions. Filtrate entering the nephron loop already has most water and solutes removed, but the nephron loop removes 50% of the remaining water and 66% of the remaining sodium and chloride ions. The descending loop, which is permeable to water only, loses water to the interstitial fluid. The filtrate becomes higher in osmotic concentration, and so the ascending loop actively pumps solutes into the interstitial fluid, and it's impermeable to water. So this creates an osmotic gradient that removes water from the descending loop, and the filtrate becomes lower in osmotic concentration. So what remains are primarily waste products. Events at the distal convoluted tubule include about 80% of the water and 85% of the solutes have been reabsorbed already. So this is just final adjustments to like the sodium reabsorption, which will increase in the presence of aldosterone, and any water reabsorption, which can increase in the presence of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So this serves to concentrate the filtrate as it passes through the collecting duct. Once the filtrate enters the minor calyx, then no other secretion or reabsorption can occur. It's done, it's set. The fluid is now called urine at that point. So the concentration and composition will vary based on metabolic and hormonal activities. So we've reached a checkpoint, and you can pause the recording to see if you can answer these two questions. Normal kidney function depends on adequate blood flow to maintain filtration pressures and a stable glomerular filtration rate. GFR is controlled by three mechanisms: autoregulation of the diameter of afferent and efferent arterioles. So this is a quick short-term adjustment of the GFR. Decreases in GFR is going to trigger dilation of the afferent arteriole and constriction of the efferent arteriole. So this will bring glomerular blood pressure up and increase GFR back to normal. If there's an increase in blood pressure, this causes an increase in glomerular filtration rate, which triggers a stretch reflex. So smooth muscles are going to respond by contracting and reducing afferent arterial diameter and reduce the flow into the glomerulus and decrease GFR back to a normal rate. GFR is also controlled by hormonal regulation, which results in long-term adjustments of blood pressure and volume that'll stabilize glomerular filtration rate. The major hormones here are angiotensin II, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, aldosterone, atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, and these mechanisms will be discussed on the next slide, so hold tight with that. But the last mechanism that glomerular filtration rate is controlled is autonomic regulation. So the direct effect of sympathetic activation is a powerful constriction of the afferent arteriole. So again, this will decrease the GFR and slow the production of filtrate. And since this is triggered by a sudden crisis, it can override local effects to stabilize the GFR. Whereas the indirect effect of the ANS can shunt blood away from the kidneys to perfuse tissues and organs with higher needs. So this can be problematic during strenuous exercise. All right, so this figure depicts the renin-angiotensin system. A decrease in blood pressure or blood volume causes the release of renin from juxtaglomerular complex, which converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. So angiotensin converting enzyme ACE converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So this causes peripheral vasoconstriction, which will increase blood pressure. Efferent arterial constriction will also occur, which can increase the GFR. And angiotensin 2 will trigger posterior pituitary to release ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. The result is an increase in blood pressure and blood volume. The increase in antidiuretic hormone is stimulated by angiotensin 2, which will lead to ultimately a drop in blood pressure and an increase in plasma solute concentration. This will result in increased water permeability at the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, and it will stimulate the thirst center in the hypothalamus to increase water intake by the organism. Aldosterone release is stimulated by angiotensin 2, and it will increase the potassium concentration in the blood plasma, which will result in reabsorption of sodium, secretion of potassium at the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts. The release of atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, is stimulated by a rise in blood pressure and volume in the atria of the heart. And this will result in inhibition of renin, aldosterone, and antidiuretic hormone, which is the opposite of the renin-angiotensin system. It'll decrease sodium reabsorption and dilate glomerular capillaries, which will increase glomerular filtration rate. So this seems like a good place to pause the recording and see if you can list the factors that affect glomerular filtration rate. So we're going to continue to follow the flow of urine through the urinary system. Urine leaves the kidneys via the ureters, which are paired muscular tubes that conduct urine to the bladder. That begins at the funnel-shaped renal pelvis and ends at the posterior, slightly inferior bladder wall. Slit-like ureteral openings into the bladder prevent backflow into the ureters. The wall of the ureters contain transitional epithelium and smooth muscle that undergoes peristalsis. The urinary bladder is a hollow muscular organ that stores urine, and the base has triangular area called the trigon, which is formed by two ureteral openings and the urethral entrance, which contains an involuntary internal urethral sphincter. The wall contains transitional epithelium and layers of smooth muscle called the detrusor muscle. The urethra extends from the neck of the urinary bladder to the exterior of the body through the external urethral orifice, which passes through the pelvic floor, and the external urethral sphincter is a voluntary skeletal muscle. In males, the urine passes through the penis before exiting the body through the external urethral orifice. And in females, the urethra is very short. The external urethral orifice is just anterior to the vagina. The micturition or urination reflex pathway is shown in this figure. Increased urine volume triggers stretch receptors in the wall of the urinary bladder, which activates afferent fibers to the sacral spinal cord, which activates parasympathetic pathway back to the bladder wall and activates interneurons relaying information to the central nervous system. Contraction then elevates pressure, which forces the internal sphincter open, and urination then occurs. Here's another checkpoint. Fluid, electrolytes, and the pH balance is a topic that integrates information from multiple chapters, and it's key to proper treatment of multiple diseases and conditions. And pH balance is essential to maintain normal chemical reactions, cell structure, and function. Electrolyte balance is essential to maintain excitable tissues like your neural tissue and muscle tissue. And water balance, of course, is essential to maintain enzyme function. For the balance of all factors, the intake must equal the output. So we're going to look at fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and the acid-base balance. So fluid balance is going to be focusing on the movement between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid, and the key here will be osmosis. The electrolyte balance is key to create osmotic gradients, and then the acid-base balance, we're going to be focusing on pH, so the hydrogen ion concentration. So we'll start with the basics of body fluid compartments. And over the semester, I've told you that the human body is kind of like just a salty sack of water and bones. And it's true, water is 50 to 60% of the body weight. And it's found in either the intracellular fluid compartment or the extracellular fluid compartment. The intracellular fluid compartment is the largest compartment. It has 25% of the total weight in adult females, about 33% of the total weight in adult males. It contains high concentrations of potassium, magnesium, and phosphoric acid, and proteins. A lot of these proteins are negatively charged, so they exert the primary osmotic pressure since they can't cross the membrane easily like the other ions. The extracellular fluid has major subdivisions. The plasma has about 4.5% of the total in males and females, and the interstitial fluid is about 18% in females and 21.5% in males. It contains a high percentage of sodium ions, chlorine ions, and carbonic acid. The plasma has proteins too, and they are going to be the main force of osmotic pressure. It has yes, that's all I want to say on that slide, because it brings us to another checkpoint. So see if you can test your knowledge so far, and we'll move on to fluid balance. So water circulates freely within the extracellular fluid compartment. The main movement occurs across capillary endothelium and into interstitial spaces and back to the blood in the venules or the lymphatics. But there's also continual movement of water across epithelial surfaces through serous membranes and synovial membranes. Small volumes of water move between the blood and cerebrospinal fluid, the aqueous and vitreous eye humors, and the peri and endolymph of the inner ear. So depending on the person, it's estimated that up to 2.5 liters of water is lost to urination, defecation, and evaporation. And these water losses are balanced by the intake of food and drink, which is about 40 to 48% of your water intake, and a small percent by a product of ATP generation in mitochondria. It's called metabolic water production. This water movement between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid is called a fluid shift. And it can occur relatively rapidly in response to changes in the osmotic concentration or osmolarity of the extracellular fluid. If the extracellular fluid becomes hypertonic, so the osmolarity increases, then water will move from the cells until equilibrium is reached. If the extracellular fluid becomes hypotonic, so osmolarity decreases, then water will move into the cells until equilibrium is reached. In effect, instead of a large change in osmotic concentration of the extracellular fluid, small changes can occur in both the extracellular and intracellular fluid compartments. Electrolyte balance is important because a gain or a loss of electrolytes can cause a gain or a loss in water. So the concentration of individual electrolytes can affect a variety of cell functions, like the excitability of neural and muscle tissues. The major contributors to osmotic concentration of the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid that directly affect normal function of all cells are sodium and potassium, but also calcium and as well. So the amount of sodium in the extracellular fluid represents a balance between sodium absorption in the digestive tract and the sodium ion excretion at the kidneys. So the rate of uptake varies greatly with your diet, and in response to aldosterone, the kidneys reabsorb sodium ions, and in response to atrial natriuretic peptide, the kidneys secrete sodium ions. So excess dietary salts can result in additional water absorption from the gut, raising blood volume and therefore raising blood pressure. Roughly 98% of the potassium content of the body lies within the intracellular fluid. Therefore, the concentration of the extracellular fluid is relatively low and represents a balance between the rate of gain across the digestive epithelium and the rate of loss in urine. Just like sodium, the rate of loss is strongly affected by the amount of potassium in the diet and aldosterone, which can cause potassium ions to be lost in the urine, so it's regulated in the distal convoluted tubule. Although an imbalance in sodium is most common cause of electrolyte imbalances, problems with potassium balance are much more dangerous because it disrupts the membrane potential in excitable tissues like, for example, the heart. So another checkpoint. The pH of your body fluids represents a balance among the acids and bases and salts in solution. The pH of the extracellular fluid normally remains within relatively narrow limits of 7.35 to 7.45. Changes in the hydrogen ion concentrations disrupt the stability of cellular membranes. It can alter proteins like enzymes, and If it alters their protein structure, it alters their function too. When the pH of blood falls below 7.35, you're in a situation of acidosis, and this can lead to central nervous system and cardiac tissue fail, as well as peripheral vasodilation, which leads to a drop in blood pressure. Alkalosis exists if the pH exceeds 7.45. Now, acidosis problems are more common than alkalosis because several acids are byproducts of normal cellular activities. In the respiratory chapter, I described how carbon dioxide, which remember is given off by ATP production, mixes with water in the blood to form carbonic acid, the most abundant acid in the body, which, like all good acids, dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions as the reaction sequence here shows. Remember that pH is a measure of hydrogen ions in solution, so the more hydrogen ions present, the more acidic and the lower the pH. Therefore, when carbon dioxide concentrations in the blood rise, remember that's measured as partial pressure, so carbon dioxide in solution, the pH becomes more acidic, meaning the pH goes down. But as carbon dioxide is exhaled into the alveoli, the pH becomes more basic, and then the pH is balanced. Acids produced in the course of normal metabolic operations are temporarily neutralized by buffers in the body fluids. Buffers are dissolved compounds that can donate or remove hydrogen ions so they can act as a weak acid or a weak base and stabilize the pH of a solution. There are three key buffer systems in the human body. The protein buffer system regulates the pH in the intracellular and extracellular fluid. If pH rises, a carboxyl group, which is a CO and an OH group, they can act as a weak acid because they can dissociate from amino acids and release a hydrogen ions. But if the pH drops, an amine group, or NH2, can act as a weak base because it picks up free hydrogens and becomes NH3. The carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, as I just described, regulates pH in the extracellular fluid. Metabolic acids are going to release hydrogen ions, lowering the pH, and this is picked up by carbonic acid HCO3. If the partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises, the respiratory system can excrete carbon dioxide. The primary buffer system in the intracellular fluid is the phosphate buffer system, since the concentration of phosphate is high there. It consists of an anion dihydrogen phosphate, which can act as a weak acid and dissociate into monohydrogen phosphate to release hydrogen ions, or vice versa. It can accept hydrogen ions and form dihydrogen phosphate as needed. Since buffering systems can tie up excess hydrogen ions, they provide a temporary solution to a low pH situation. However, the hydrogen hasn't been removed, so the buffer systems are limited in their capacity to maintain an acid-base balance. So the combination of buffers in the respiratory system and renal mechanisms involved in hydrogen ion loss and gain is responsible for maintaining the homeostasis of the acid-base balance. And this can be accomplished by altering the respiration rate. So low partial pressures of carbon dioxide result in a rise in pH, and respiration is suppressed. Carbonic acid formula will be driven to the right, conserving carbon dioxide, while releasing hydrogen ions, which lowers the pH. If there's a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that will result in a lower pH, which will then stimulate respiration. And the carbonic acid formula on the previous slide will be driven to the left, blowing off carbon dioxide, giving it or releasing it. And this will absorb hydrogen ions, which raises the pH. Renal contributions to the pH regulation is the only way to truly eliminate hydrogen ions, because the tubules can conserve hydrogen ions and eliminate carbonic acid when pH is high, or it could eliminate hydrogen ions and conserve carbonic acid when the pH is low. And that concludes the lecture on Chapter 18, the urinary system.